My son told me I was a burden the morning after I cooked him breakfast. That's how I want to start this, because that's exactly how it felt. No build-up, no warning, just eggs on the plate and then those words, matter of fact, like he was reading a weather report. Dad, honestly, if you're not going to help with the boys, I don't know why we thought this would work. I stood at the kitchen counter with my back to him, still holding the spatula. The eggs were getting cold. I didn't turn around. That was 8 months after I moved in. Let me tell you how it started. Because it didn't start with cruelty. It never does. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday evening in late September, when the leaves on the oak tree outside my apartment window had just begun to turn. My son called, and his voice had that particular quality to it, warm and careful at the same time, the way it gets when he needs something but hasn't decided how to ask yet. He said his wife was going back to work full-time. The boys were 4 and 7. Daycare for both of them was running nearly $2,000 a month, and that didn't include the school pickup for the older one or the after-school hours. He said they'd done the math. He said it would mean the world to them. He said I had a bedroom waiting, a real one with a window and a closet, not some fold-out situation. I was 63 years old. I had retired from 31 years in facilities management 8 months earlier. I had a decent apartment, a routine I'd built carefully since my wife passed 4 years before, a Thursday poker game, a Saturday morning walk along the river with a neighbor named Gerald, who told terrible jokes and made excellent coffee. I had a life that was quiet and mine, but my son had that voice. And I hadn't lived near my grandchildren in 6 years. And I thought this is what I thought. And I want to be honest about it. I thought this was an opportunity, not a favor. An opportunity to be present, to be useful in a way that felt meaningful rather than decorative. My own father had been distant. I had spent a long time not wanting to be him, so I said yes. I gave up the apartment. I put most of my furniture in a storage unit because my son's house was already furnished and there wasn't room. I kept my reading chair. I loaded it into the moving truck myself, and my son helped carry it up the stairs to my bedroom, and he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Dad, this is going to be great." I mean it. I believed him. The first weeks were good. I want to say that clearly, because the whole story isn't darkness. The younger one, who was 4, would appear at my bedroom door some mornings before anyone else was awake and stand there until I noticed him, and then he'd grin like he'd gotten away with something. I'd make us both toast, and we'd sit at the kitchen table while the house was still quiet. And he'd tell me in great seriousness about whatever was happening in his preschool social world. It was the best part of my day. I picked up the older one from school at 3. I got the younger one from preschool at noon. I was home with both of them from noon until my son or his wife got back, which was usually around 6, sometimes 6:30, occasionally later. I cooked most nights because it made sense I was home. I was already making something for the boys. It was efficient. I told myself it was efficient. My son's wife was not a warm person. I want to be fair. She wasn't cruel, not at first. She was efficient and organized and treated the household like a project to be managed. She'd leave a handwritten list on the kitchen counter most mornings, not a request, just a list. Dry cleaning, a permission slip that needed to go back to school, a specific brand of yogurt the boys would eat. The dishwasher needs to be unloaded. The recycling goes Tuesday. I did the things on the list. I didn't say anything about it because I told myself I was being helpful. I told myself this was what living with family meant. I told myself I was not a guest. Somewhere around month 3, I started to understand that I was not being treated like family either. It happened in accumulation, the way these things do. It wasn't one moment. It was the way my son's wife would come home and walk through the kitchen where I'd cooked dinner and ask, "Did you marinate the chicken?" when the chicken was already on the table. It was the way she'd find something to add to the list, even on days I'd done everything on it. It was the way she'd talk to my son about scheduling the boys' dentist appointments, the school fundraiser, who was picking up who on which day, as if I weren't sitting at the same table, as if I were a piece of the logistical furniture. I started taking my coffee to my room in the mornings. My son noticed, I think. He'd knock on my door sometimes in the evening, lean against the frame, ask how I was doing. I'd say fine. He'd say good. We'd talk about the boys. He'd leave. I don't know what he thought was happening, or whether he was choosing not to think about it. Month 5 was when things shifted. My son's wife started leaving the list on my bedroom door instead of the kitchen counter. That sounds like a small thing, and maybe it is, but there is a difference between a note left in a shared space and a note left on your private door. One is household communication. The other is an assignment. The list got longer. I was driving to 3 different places on some days. I was managing both boys' schedules, their activities, their moods, their meals. I was doing the grocery run twice a week. I was handling most of the laundry because my son's wife mentioned once, offhandedly, that she never had time to get to it, and I'd done it that day without thinking, and somehow it became mine. My back had been bad for years. A compression issue at L4 and L5, the result of 20 years of walking job sites and lifting things I shouldn't have lifted. I managed it with stretches in the morning and careful positioning and knowing my limits. I knew, for instance, that I couldn't carry both boys' backpacks and my son's wife's dry cleaning and the 2 bags of groceries up the front steps in one trip. I knew I needed to sit down after a certain number of hours on my feet. I knew that some days, the pain was bad enough that I moved slowly and carefully and needed the day to be lighter. My son's wife did not factor this into the list. I mentioned it once. I said, "My back's been acting up this week. I might need to make the grocery run 2 separate trips." She looked at me briefly and said, "That's fine," and wrote 2 things on the next day's list. I started keeping count, not intentionally, just because I'm the kind of person who notices patterns. In month 6, I had 1 full day where I had nothing scheduled. One day, I spent it in my reading chair with a book I'd been meaning to finish for 4 months, and I felt guilty about it, which tells you something about where my head was by then. The boys were the reason I stayed. I want to be honest about that too. The younger one had started calling me Grandpa D, his version of my name, which is Dennis, and it had caught on even with the older one, who was 7 and generally considered himself too sophisticated for nicknames. They came to my room. They showed me things. The older one was reading chapter books now and would come in sometimes to tell me about them with such intensity that I'd put down whatever I was doing just to watch his face. These were real things. They mattered. But by month 7, something had shifted in me that I hadn't fully recognized yet. I was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning with the low background hum of the day's obligations already running. Preschool pickup at noon, school pickup at 3. Whatever was on the door, dinner, dishes, sit with the boys while they wound down, put them to bed if my son and his wife were running late, which they were, with increasing regularity. My Thursday poker game, which I'd been driving 20 minutes to attend every week since I moved in, became every other week, then once a month. Then I stopped going because the drive felt like too much at the end of a full day and I'd come home tired and distracted anyway. Gerald and I texted, but our Saturday morning walks had quietly ended when I missed enough of them that it became easier not to schedule them. I had stopped being Dennis. I had become a function. The morning of the eggs, I had been up since 5. My back was in a bad stretch that week. Cold weather does something to it. I'd done my stretches, taken something for the pain, moved carefully. I made breakfast because I was up and it seemed kind. My son came downstairs at 7, sat at the table, and I put the plate in front of him. He ate for a moment. Then, without looking up, he said what he said. "Dad, honestly, if you're not going to help with the boys, I don't know why we thought this would work." I set the spatula on the counter. I had been with both boys every day for 7 months. I had picked them up and dropped them off and fed them, and sat with them through ear infections and school project meltdowns and the particular grief of a 7-year-old who didn't make the team he wanted. I had given them all of it. "What does that mean?" I said. He looked up then, slightly surprised by my tone. I think he said his wife felt like I was pulling back, that lately I seemed less engaged, that they needed to know they could count on me. I didn't say everything I could have said. I said, "My back hurts, Marcus. I need some days where the list is shorter." He said, "Dad, we're not asking for anything unreasonable." I thought about my apartment. I thought about the oak tree. I thought about Gerald's terrible jokes. I said, "Okay." I don't know why I said okay. Exhaustion, maybe. The habit of accommodation. The boys asleep upstairs. I said okay, and I went to my room and I sat in my reading chair and I looked at the wall and I understood something with a clarity that I had been avoiding for months. This was not going to change. Not because my son was a bad person. I don't believe he is. But because the situation had been allowed to become what it was. And no one in it had any incentive to acknowledge that. My son's wife had a free household manager. My son had the comfort of not having to think about logistics or his father's well-being simultaneously. They had told themselves a story about what this arrangement was, and in that story, I was not a person with a back and a life and a Thursday poker game. I was a solution. The word my son had used that morning, help with the boys. As if 7 months of daily care was a baseline, so assumed it had become invisible. And the problem was that I was not doing enough beyond it. I started making a plan. I want to be clear about what the plan was and wasn't. It was not revenge, despite the way people tend to describe things like this. I was not interested in a confrontation. I was not looking for an apology, though perhaps I should have been. I was 63 years old, and I was tired, and I simply wanted to live in a place where my presence was not measured by its utility. I called Gerald first. I hadn't talked to him in 6 weeks. And he answered on the second ring and said, "Dennis, where the hell have you been?" And I said, "Nowhere good." And he laughed his big laugh, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. I didn't move fast. I spent 3 weeks quietly, without announcement, doing 3 things. I called a property management company I'd worked with years ago and asked about availability. I made an appointment with my doctor about my back. The first one I'd made since moving in because I hadn't had time. I went through my finances, which I hadn't looked at carefully since the move, and found that 7 months of no rent, no groceries, and no separate utilities had left me in a better position than I'd expected. I found an apartment on a Tuesday. First floor, 2 bedrooms, a small patio facing a yard, 15 minutes from my son's house. I signed the lease on a Thursday. Then drove to my old Thursday poker game for the first time in 4 months. And Mike dealt me in without comment, and Gerald refilled my coffee, and no one asked me where I'd been, which was exactly the right response. I didn't tell my son for a week. I needed to be certain, and I needed the certainty to be calm rather than reactive. I told him on a Sunday evening, after the boys were in bed. I sat down with him at the kitchen table, just the 2 of us. His wife upstairs, and I told him I was moving out at the end of the month. I told him I had found a place I liked. I told him I would still see the boys. I would come for Sunday dinners if I was invited. I would go to their school things. I was not disappearing. He stared at me for a long time. He said, "Is this about what I said? About the eggs?" "It's about a lot of things," I said. "But I don't want to make it a list." He started to say something about the boys' schedule, about the logistics, about his wife going back to work. I let him talk. When he finished, I said, "Marcus, you have to figure out the logistics. That's the job of being a parent." I was glad to help. "But I'm not a solution. I'm your father." He was quiet after that. He said, "Dad, I didn't mean it the way it sounded." "I know," I said. And I believed that, mostly. The problem had never been that he meant to be cruel. The problem was that he had stopped seeing me clearly, and I had let him, and neither of us had said anything about it, until it had become the whole shape of the thing. We didn't fix everything that night. You don't, usually. There wasn't a hug, and a moment of perfect understanding. He nodded slowly and said he needed to talk to his wife, and I said that was reasonable, and I went to my room. Moving day was a Saturday. My son helped me carry the reading chair down the stairs. He didn't say much. At the door, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder and said, "The boys are going to miss you." I said I wasn't going anywhere, just down the road, and I meant it. Gerald came with his truck for the second load. The apartment was smaller than what I'd had before. The bedroom window faced the neighbor's fence rather than an oak tree. The kitchen was narrow and the water pressure was inconsistent, and the floor in the hallway creaked in a way that I was already finding comforting. The way a particular creak in a place becomes yours. I unpacked the reading chair first. I put it by the window. I made coffee in a pot I'd had in storage for 8 months, and it tasted exactly the way I remembered. I sat there for a while, just sitting, not managing anything or going anywhere or waiting for the next thing on the list. It was very quiet. The first Sunday, my son called and asked if I wanted to come for dinner. I said yes. The younger one ran at me when I walked in the door and bounced off my legs the way he does, and I picked him up even though my back said not to, because some calculations are not strictly physical. The older one showed me his chapter book and told me the plot with his usual intensity. My son's wife was polite in a careful way that I recognized as the beginning of something, though I couldn't say what. Dinner was slightly awkward. That's fine. It was honest. I drove home at 8:30, the 15 minutes quiet and familiar, and I pulled into my parking spot and sat for a moment with the engine off. My back was aching. I had a doctor's appointment on Wednesday. Gerald and I had a walk scheduled for Saturday morning. I had bought a new book that I planned to start tonight, in my chair, by my window, with nobody's list on my door. I thought about the boys. I thought about my son, who loves me and failed me and is figuring out, I hope, what the difference between those two things means. I thought about my wife. She had known how to draw lines. I never learned to draw, quickly and without apology, and I had admired it and relied on it and never quite absorbed it myself. I think she would have something pointed to say about the last 8 months. I think she would say it with a smile. I thought about what the older one had said to me at dinner, out of nowhere, the way 7-year-olds will. He'd looked up from his plate and said, "Grandpa D, are you going to be okay over there?" I'd said, "Yes, I'm going to be just fine." He'd looked at me with that evaluating look he has, the one that reminds me of his grandmother, and then he'd nodded once like he'd made a decision and gone back to his food. I turned off the engine and went inside. I made tea, not coffee, because it was late. I set it on the small table by my reading chair. I opened the book. Outside the window, the neighbor's fence was dark, and above it a strip of sky. And in the sky a few stars, sharper than they ever were with city light around them. A man gets to choose what kind of space he takes up. Not because someone gives him that right, but because at some point, if you are paying attention, you understand that no one is going to hand it to you. You have to simply stop apologizing for existing and go find the room where you fit. I had spent a long time not taking up enough of the right kind of space. That ends now.